Well, good morning, Grace Point. My name is Michael Camber. I'm one of the elders in training that the other elders in Ty have been investing in over the last year or so, and it's a pleasure to be with you here this morning to share God's Word with you. And maybe you can relate to this. So when I was growing up, in elementary school, middle school even, you'd be at school sitting around the table, and maybe you would share what you did over the weekend. And then maybe it wasn't that great, like, oh, I went to the mall, went shopping, whatever. And then maybe the next kid says, that's nothing, dude. I went to an amusement park, I rode roller coasters. It was great. What you did this weekend was nothing compared to what I did. And then it goes back and forth. Maybe it goes to the next kid, and then he one-ups him, and then the next kid one-ups him. And we go back and forth, and we just one-up each other. And we eventually get to a stalemate where nobody can agree, hey, I had the better weekend. So then it escalates. It gets, serious. And it's, oh, yeah, well, my brother can beat you up. And then it goes back and forth and said, oh, yeah, well, my brother is 2 years older than your brother. He's in 6th grade. He can beat your brother up and you. And then it gets out of hand. It gets to, oh, yeah, well, my sister, she's in, high school. She can drive a car. She'll just come mow you guys over. And then if it gets way out of hand, it goes to daddies. And I knew that in this situation that, I would never want to argue brothers and sisters and that stuff, mainly because I'm an only child. I really didn't have anything to argue with. But it would get to me, and I'd be like, you know what? My dad can beat up your dad. And I would feel accomplished. I'm like, yep, that's it. That's my trump card, so to speak. You guys know what a trump card is, right? Like if you're playing the game of spades, it's a card game. In that game, the ace of spades is the trump card. It wins, hands down, no contest. You play the ace of spades, the game is over. It beats every other card, including the king of spades, which is the second best card in that game. So my trump card was my dad. So I knew if it got to me and it got out of hand, it got crazy, my brother's going to beat you up. I'm like, whatever, dude. My dad can beat up your dad. And I knew this for one reason. It's because my dad knew karate. And it wasn't he, did karate in elementary school or middle school when he was younger and he took a couple classes. This is my dad is an adult going and doing karate lessons weekly. And I knew that that was my confidence. And I knew that in my basement growing up, my dad had nunchucks and swords and he had this giant bow staff that was probably 6 or 7 feet tall with this massive blade on it. I'm like, listen, if push came to shove, my dad's on this, dude. You don't want none. But I started thinking, why do we do that? Why do we feel the need to want to trump each other and one-up each other in that? And it made me realize we do this because we want to feel like we're accepted. We want to feel okay. We want to make ourselves right or accepted before other people. And in a sense, we're looking for our sense of righteousness in that. We play that trump card that says, game over, I win, you can't argue with me, no contest. And today, we're going to look at a story in the Bible in the book of John where Jesus is having a conversation with some Jewish men. And in this conversation, Jesus is going to say some things to them that's really going to push them on some things. And they're going to play a trump card with Jesus. And Jesus is going to challenge them on that trump card. And maybe that's you this morning. Maybe you're holding on to some trump cards. And maybe Jesus, through his word, is going to challenge you on those this morning. So let's look at this scripture. We're going to be in the book of John, chapter 8, verses, we're going to read 31 through 47. We're going to read the first couple verses first. By the way, if you don't have a Bible, we have some out back that you're more than welcome to take. We want everybody to have a Bible here at Grace Point. If you don't have a Bible with you this morning, it's going to be on the screen behind us. You can follow along. So, verses 31 through 32. So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So already up front, we see that these Jewish men have already to a degree believed some things that Jesus has said. Jesus has been traveling throughout Jerusalem, going around teaching, and he's already taught in a way that have caught the attention of some Jewish men. They're coming in and they want to hear more about what Jesus has to say. And he says, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. And the word abide is kind of a funny word in 2013. We don't hear it a lot, but that it simply means to remain in or to continue in or to stay in. So Jesus says, if you stay in my word, then you are truly my disciples. And then the next verse he says, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So just after hearing this, after Jesus say this, I would have two questions. What is the truth, and what do I need to be set free from? And how would you answer those questions this morning? Let's pretend you're 2,000 years ago, you're standing around with some guys, Jesus is talking to you, And he says those. How would you answer those questions? What is the truth, and what do I need to be set free from? And maybe you this morning are in the position, maybe you're just here visiting, maybe you said, I've been to church a few times, and maybe you're just checking all this Jesus stuff out. And there are a lot of ideas out there today about truth, what it is, how you can obtain it, where it comes from. But in the Bible, Jesus makes some pretty exclusive claims about truth and what it is. And he doesn't say how you can, he doesn't say how you can get to a truth or one of many truths. So Jesus says how you can get to the truth. And he says that if you're a disciple of his, then you will know that truth, and that truth will set you free. But set free from what? So we'll get to that. But how do these Jewish men respond? They throw down their trump card. So let's continue reading in verse 33. They answered him, "We are the offspring of Abraham and have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free?" So these Jewish men, they kind of answer back with their trump card or their pedigree or their qualifications, more or less. They say, boom, we got Abraham. They say, we are the offspring of Abraham and have never been slaves. So just following this, if we've never been slaves, what do we need to be set free from? Just a quick note about Abraham. Abraham is like the guy in Jewish history. He is the first guy that God really calls out from his homeland, from his family, from everything he knows. God says, come follow me, I'll make you a great nation. I'll be your God, you'll be my people. And God makes this covenant or this promise with Abraham. So Abraham is a huge deal. He's a big deal. And in Genesis 15:16, it says, "And Abraham believed the Lord, and God counted it to him as righteousness." And what we're going to see from this is that other people cannot be my trump card. Other people cannot be my trump card. And that the best way to describe using other people as your trump card is a little term I found out last week called name dropping. You guys familiar with name dropping? The more I read this text, I was like, dude, that's exactly what they're doing. But you know how like if I'm unsure of what a word means, I like to Google it, because especially now in pop culture, like so many words are being invented every day, like you don't want to say something like, whoa, that was not the right word to say. So I Googled name dropping, and this is exactly what these Jewish men are doing with Jesus here by saying, hey, Abraham. So let me define for you what I Googled, what name dropping means. To mention casually the names of illustrious or famous people in order to imply that one is on familiar terms with them, intended as a means of self-promotion. And that is exactly what they're doing here. To give you another good example of that, my 9-to-5 job during the week, I work at a pawn shop downtown on the Strip. And if you've lived in Vegas for any length of time or you watch reality TV show, you know which pawn shop I'm talking about, right? Pawn Stars. You guys heard of that? Okay, to further name drop and make myself look goofy, I know Chumley, I know the other guys. Like, I know those guys. I have their cell phone numbers. You guys think more of me now? That's kind of what's going on. Like, you could probably, if you ever see them, be like, hey, do you know this Michael guy? He works at your shop. He's like, yeah, that weird dude whatever, I know him, whatever. But that's fine. Name dropping isn't the most honest maneuver that, if we can think of. But that's exactly what they're doing in this situation. So the Jews more or less thought, because of our father Abraham, because of this guy, which, by the way, Abraham had been dead for a long time, so it's not like these guys actually knew. Like, we go, hey, Abraham, how's it going? You know me? I'm, this guy. So the Jews more or less thought, because of their forefather Abraham, we're good with God, right? Hey, Jesus, we know Abraham. We don't need to hear all this other stuff about being set free and whatnot. We know Abraham. But Jesus is going to challenge them specifically on that trump card. He's going to show them that other people cannot be their trump card. Let's continue reading in verses 34 through 38. It says, Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not remain in the house forever, but the son remains forever. So if the son sets you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you are the offspring of Abraham, yet you seek to kill me because my word finds no place in you. I speak of what I have seen with my father, and you do what you have heard from your father." So, just a quick note about this. Jesus isn't dull. Like, he's been around for a long time. Jesus is also Jewish. So he would have grown up, Jewish culture, Jewish history, all this stuff, just like these men were. So if you can kind of imagine Jesus kind of scratching his head like, dude, I know who Abraham is. What are you talking about? But he goes on in this verse to make a distinction, because Abraham says, our father, Abraham. And Jesus says, hey, there's a difference between who I'm claiming as my father and your father. So it's very important. So Jesus essentially says that everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Now, if you've been, like I said, around church for a while, or you've been around church people for a while, then you've heard of the word sin. It gets thrown around a lot. But I'm sure with everything else, that can kind of get muddled down and maybe a little fuzzy. So let me just give you some example of what sin is. Have you ever told a lie? The Bible says lying is sin. The Bible also says to obey the laws of the land. Has anyone ever driven over the speed limit? That would be sin. Have you ever hurt someone, maybe verbally or even physically? That is sin. Have you ever been bitter towards someone? Maybe harbored bad feelings, bad thoughts towards someone? That is also sin. And we see also in the book of John, Jesus talks about sins that we have internally as well as externally. We sin in our hearts as well. Jesus says that if you have lusted after someone in your heart, then you may as well have committed adultery. Jesus says that if you hate someone in your heart, you may as well have committed murder. So we sin internally and externally. We sin all the time. And Jesus says in this verse that if you've ever sinned even once, then you're a slave to it. A slave. A slave has no rights and is in no control of his destiny. If we are slaves to sin, we have no control over it. Like our only option is to sin because we're slaves to it. Think about this picture that Jesus gives us, though. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The son remains forever. If we break this picture down a little more, we can kind of see where Jesus is getting at. Jesus affirms that as a slave in any given household, they only have power or influence for a short time. They're not the son. They're not the heir to the household. In reality, they're not actually part of the family. So Jesus says, if the son sets you free, and if you look in your Bible, you'll see son right there. When Jesus says that, it has a capital S. That means that Jesus is referring to himself, not just a generic, if a member of the family sets a slave free, you're free. Jesus said, if the son sets you free, then you are really, really free. And he's talking about himself. Because a slave has no power to set himself free, nor anyone else for that matter. Only a member of the household has that power, and Jesus alone, as the Son of God, has the authority and the power to set people free from sin and slavery to it. See, when we get enslaved to sin, we are slave to it. We cover things. And think about it like this. Have you ever told like a little white lie to somebody that you maybe said in passing, and like a couple days later you run into that person, and they're like, hey, how's, whatever going? And you're like, oh, wait a minute. What did I tell them? That's right. Okay, then yes, that's exactly what I said. And then maybe a couple days later, you run into somebody else, and somebody else gets drawn to the situation. Hey, so-and-so told me that this is happening. Is that what's going on? And you're like, wait a minute. Yeah, that's happening. And then I told them that, and then I told them that, and then I lied to them about that. So essentially, you become a slave to that sin. You become a slave to that lie, and you are bound to it. Because unless you want to get found out and be called a liar, you're going to keep lying to cover that. So this morning, if you're not yet a follower of Christ or a disciple of Jesus, please don't miss what Jesus is getting at in these verses. In verse 31, Jesus talked about being set free from something. He says you need to be set free. And this is exactly what he's talking about. Sin. You need to be set free from sin. Jesus calls these men on their trump card because through their trump card that they're trying to play, they thought that they could inherit their way into a right standing with God. They thought their trump card in Abraham would make them right. But what they don't get quite yet, and we're going to see it soon, is that Jesus is really the only trump card. So basically the whole argument that the Jews have presented to Jesus right here is this. They would say, Abraham did, therefore I get. Abraham was right before God, therefore I am too. And if we fast forward that mentality 2,000 years in the future to where we are right now today, here's what this can look like for you and me. My father worked, therefore I deserve. My parents worked, therefore I deserve. My grandparents were good people. Therefore I deserve to be considered a good person as well. My family has a good name, a good reputation, therefore I'm good to go. I am righteous. My parents go to church. Hey, I'm good to go. If you're a student this morning, if you're middle, high, elementary school, you need to hear this. If you're if you come to church with your parents and you think, hey, I don't need to really get involved or pay attention to the guy talking on stage, and I don't really need to pay attention to all this Bible, Jesus stuff, here's what you need to hear this morning. You do. You have to own that faith. You have to own your own faith in Jesus yourself. You can't ride on the backs of your parents' coattails for that. Other people cannot be your trump card. You cannot claim your parents as, hey, my parents are good people, so God, I'm good to go, right? Because they went to church and they read the Bible and they prayed and all that stuff. That doesn't work. And I can't tell you how many times I've had this conversation with people. Maybe you're meeting somebody new for the first time, and it's, when you're getting to know someone, you ask questions, you talk about people. And they say, oh, well, how did you wind up in Vegas? Because, most people that live in Vegas aren't from Vegas, so you usually have a pretty good story of how you wound up here. And I tell people, I moved out here in 2009 to come serve and work at Grace Point Church. And people are like, oh, you go to church? That's great. I have an uncle who's a pastor. And that's great. I'm glad, if you have a pastor in your family, that's wonderful. If you have people in your family that go to church, but maybe you don't quite regularly, that's great too. But the only benefit you gain from that is hopefully seeing the life of Jesus lived out in front of you. You don't get brownie points with God because you know somebody on the inside of the church game. You can't name drop with God is what I'm trying to get at. And the reason for this is because every one of us is born with something called a sin nature. Everyone is born with it. Adam and Eve started it way back in the beginning of time. In the book of Genesis, they ate the fruit, rebelled against God, and ever since then they passed it down to us from generation to generation to generation. And Adam's rebellion, unfortunately, didn't just, affect him. He blew it for everybody. In the book of Romans, verses 12 and 14, I want to read a couple verses for you. It says, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and this way death spread to all men because all sinned. If you are a human being in this room today, you have sinned. And then verse 14, it says, nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those who did not sin in the likeness of Adam's transgression. He is a prototype of the one to come. So basically, even if you can say, hey, Michael, I didn't eat the fruit, that ain't my fault. The Bible says you're still responsible to deal with your own sin. This morning, if your trump card or your righteousness is based on something that was maybe passed down from your parents, or you think you're getting it from someone else you know, if it's from another human being, Jesus trumps that. Jesus says, that's not good enough, that will not win you the proverbial game. Paul is a big deal in the New Testament. He wrote the majority of the New Testament, he wrote it down. In the book of Romans, he is addressing this very similar situation because he was talking to some Jewish people and this was coming out, and so Paul was addressing that. And I love how he words this because this would have made total sense because Paul, who was also Jewish, he would have related well to these men who Jesus is talking to. And not just in a casual way, Paul was up here in Judaism, he was a Pharisee, he was the religious elite. If there was a big deal in the Jewish culture world back then, it was Paul. So Paul understands this after Jesus changes him, and this is what he writes. And this is Romans 3, 9 through 11. He says, what then? Are we Jews any better off? He says, not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks, and when he says Greeks right here, he means basically people who aren't Jewish, are under sin. As it is written, no one is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks after God. And then verse 20 says, for by the works of the law, by, we'll say, behaviorism or moralism, or by your family tree even, by your mom, your dad, the things they did, no human being will be justified in his sight. And that word justified, you can break it down to maybe, it's just as if I'd never sinned. And that word also means made right. So Paul says no one will be made right in God's sight by works of the law. And you see that what the Jews would claim as their righteousness or their trump card isn't actually any kind of righteousness at all. It's God's wrath. They inherited God's wrath. They earned God's wrath. It's inherited sin, inherited death. Because what the truth of Jesus has just shown us right here is that righteousness cannot be inherited if it's being inherited from any man who is descended from Adam, from the first human. And that's all of us. You cannot be made right by something or someone that isn't already right. Broken people cannot fix broken people. Moving on, we're going to look at verses 39 through 42. And they answered him, Abraham is our father. So again, they throw their trump card down immediately. And Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works that Abraham did. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You are doing the works your father did. And they said to him, we were not born of sexual immorality. We have one Father, even God. But Jesus said to them, if God were your Father, you would love me. For I came from God, and I am here. And I came not of my own accord or of my own will, but he sent me. So again, right off the bat, we see the Jews throw down their trump card. They say, Jesus, we got Abraham. Jesus, you don't understand. We know Abraham. And again, Jesus challenges it. He basically says, if you guys were the children of Abraham, even if that was true, your trump card still doesn't work because you would do the works, you would do the things that Abraham did, but you don't. Jesus tells them that their trump card still doesn't work. And how many of us do this? We tell ourselves that, hey, we're okay. We tell ourselves we're okay because, hey, my parents were good people. I don't hurt anybody. I obey the law. I'm generous with people and my money. I'm not a greedy person. I'm spiritual. I go to church once in a while. How many of us say those things to ourselves? We want to make ourselves right by the works, by the things that we do, by the good things we do, and we just want to make ourselves okay. We tell ourselves that, hey, in this life, as long as I do enough good to outweigh maybe some of the bad stuff I've done in my life, we're covered, right? Because we're good people. We say, hey, my father was a good guy and respected, therefore I'll do the same things that he did, and I'll be good, and I'll be respected. But Jesus goes on again in this verse to make a clear distinction between who his father is and who their father is. But it's not really the distinction that they wanted. And we'll pick up in verses 33 and 34, and we'll see exactly why. He says, why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word. You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. So if you can imagine how awkward that is. You are of your father, the devil. So sure, they can hear Jesus, but I think it's one of those situations like, yeah, they're hearing him, but are they really listening? I doubt it. Jesus tells them that they cannot bear to hear his word. Have you ever heard something that you can't bear? Like it's just like, oh, like maybe nails on a chalkboard. Like that's pretty excruciating, right? The one thing in my life, the noise that I can't bear to listen to is that tone that comes on right before like a National Weather Service warning, that pixelated dial-up noise. It would make me cringe. Or what about another one is like a dying battery in a smoke detector? You sitting on your couch watching TV, beep. Whatever, I'm imagining things. Maybe it was a TV. Beep. All right, that's a smoke detector. I got to find it. And you spend like 20 minutes looking, every room in your house to figure out which one it is. But Jesus says they cannot bear to hear my word. Again, Jesus destroys their trump card. He says Abraham doesn't work here. He basically says, hey, your father's the devil, and your trump card doesn't work. And it's not that these guys were literally the children of the devil, but they shared that inherent, or that same sin nature that Satan had. The same sin nature that made Satan rebel against God in the beginning, that he went and caused Adam and Eve to sin against God and rebel against God. It's that same rebellious nature that is against God that he's telling them that they possess. That's why he says, you are more reflective of the devil in the way that you live, act, believe who God is, more so than you are of Abraham. So God told Abraham the truth. And in the Bible it says, Abraham believed God, and he was made right because of it. Again, I love how the Apostle Paul words things in the book of Romans, chapter 4, 1 through 3. He says, what then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified or made right by his works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So Paul even says, hey, even if Abraham was made right by his works, even if Abraham was accepted by other people because he was a quote-unquote good person, then maybe he has something to brag about or to boast about with people, but not before God. And the best way, again, to explain this is that each one of us has this deep-seated desire that stems out of our sin nature, and we do this. We want other people to approve of us. We work for other people's approval, and we take value from the way other people perceive us. And in this context, it can look like your relationship with your parents. Now, how many of you guys growing up, you loved your parents and you wanted to make your parents proud, right? So you would do things. Your parents would say, "Hey, don't do that. Don't, throw dishes around the house and break them because that's rude." But you didn't want to disappoint your parents, right? We all loved our parents, and we wanted to do what our parents told us because it honors our parents. But again, we didn't want to just not disappoint them. We wanted to make our parents proud. And we did this by getting good grades, maybe by hanging out with the right people at school, making good friends. We went out of our way to make our parents proud. And we still do this as adults. If you're like me, later on in life, maybe it's good financial decisions. Maybe it's who you choose to spend your time with, who you marry even, whether or not you go to college. I mean, throughout all of your life, we have this innate desire, like, hey, am I making my parents proud? Am I doing good by my parents? And maybe you didn't have both your parents growing up. Maybe you were raised in a single-parent home, or maybe you were even raised by people who weren't necessarily your biological parents. But the fact of the matter is that if you had a human mother and a human father, and 100% of us in this room did, you have this indwelling sin nature that is against God and that is against you, and tells you that, hey, if you're a good person, if you work hard enough, if you're generous, if you impress the right people, if you can impress God with your life, then yeah, you get to go to heaven. But Isaiah, in his book, tells us pretty graphically, to a degree, where our good works get us with God. In Isaiah 64, he says, all of our righteous acts are like polluted garments. I know there's probably some smaller kids in here, so I'll spare you the awkward conversation. The polluted garment he's referring to isn't like a dirty dish rag, or, hey, I work outside and got some stuff on my clothes. Use your imagination. He's not referring to any of those things. Polluted garment. Use your imagination. But this is the image that God, in his word, chose to use to illustrate how our ability to work ourselves, to make ourselves right for God. In the end, it's disgusting, really. You can't do it. You need something outside of yourself. You can't be your own trump card with God. And the reality is that Jesus is the only trump card. Let me give you a few things that aren't trump cards. Attending church is not a trump card. Giving your money is not a trump card. Being a good person is not a trump card. Being a religious person, not a trump card. I'll give you a good example. I grew up in church, for the most part. I grew up in a Christian home. My parents brought me to church every Sunday. And through that, at some point, I didn't want to be a bad kid growing up. Like, I realized, hey, it's just easier to do what my parents ask. I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want to get my stuff taken away. I don't want to sit in timeout. So for the most part, I grew up a good kid. And that's how basically my outlook on life was from elementary to high school. My righteousness, if you will, was based on not breaking the 3 unspoken good person rules in school. And maybe, I don't know if anybody's ever put these into words for you. I hope that this is kind of on par with where you guys are at too. Number 1, don't smoke. Don't smoke in school, you're a good person. Number 2, don't drink alcohol or don't get into drugs. If you don't do that in high or school, people probably think you're a good person. And the last one is don't have sex before you're married. Now, maybe that's not out here. I grew up in a small town in Kentucky, and that was like a big deal. People were like, oh, do you know what they're doing? So, but that was my righteousness, or how I made myself right to other people and to God growing up. I did those things, and I got the approval of people. And I don't say all that stuff to make myself look good. I say all that to show you that if being a good person and trying to make yourself right to other people and doing all the right things mattered, if it got you anywhere, then I had it down. Like, I had it right. Functionally, even though I'd already given my life to Jesus, functionally, day to day, the way I acted, the way I behaved, the way I believed things about God, I did not need Jesus. That was the lie that I believed, that good people don't need Jesus. And maybe that's you this morning. Maybe you've been going through life as a good person. Maybe you've avoided the whole church and God thing because you think, hey, I obey the law, I pay my taxes on time, I don't hurt anybody. I've got all this church business stuff covered, If I die and God happens to be real, then, I'm probably covered. But in this text, Jesus says to know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So let me tell you the truth this morning. You cannot earn your righteousness. You cannot make yourself right before God. The only thing you can earn is God's wrath. You can earn death, and you can earn eternal separation from God. Those are the things we can earn. Romans 6:23 says, "For the wages of sin is death." A wage is a payment, or a paycheck, if you will. So if you have a job, the paycheck you get on Friday is reflective for what you did Monday through Friday. In a sense, you deserve that paycheck on Friday because you didn't just go to work for nothing, right? You don't work for free. You earn that. You cannot make yourself right on your own. You cannot be your own trump card. A broken person cannot fix themselves. Jesus is the only trump card. Verse 45 and 46. Jesus says, "But because I tell you the truth, you do not believe me. Which one of you convicts me of sin? If I tell the truth, why do you not believe me?" And this is what Jesus is getting at. Jesus is God. The one who does not sin trumps all, and these men in this conversation could not accuse Jesus of any sins. Jesus is the only trump card. You see, because of Abraham, they would have believed that, hey, we're from God, we're good, we're of God. But Jesus, who is God, just told them that they weren't. And in the end, Jesus kind of concedes in the conversation to a degree, like, yeah, sure, you guys are the children of Abraham, but that's not any place to boast or to brag about, because Abraham is still a human of flesh descended from Adam who had a sin nature. Abraham was made right by God, not by his own works, not by his father's works, but by the work of God. And the same is true, the same that was true for the Jewish men in this conversation is the same that is true for you and me today. We can't make ourselves right before God. Jesus does that work on our behalf. And why does it matter to be of God when Jesus says this? Because after this life, the Bible spells out pretty clearly what waits on the other side. Either you put the weight of your life on Jesus so that when you die, you can claim him as your trump card, you can claim him as your righteousness from his perfect life, or you can carry that weight yourself, be your own trump card, and take all of your good deeds and all of your good works bundled up in a nice little polluted garment and take it to God and say, hey, God, is this good enough? Is my trump card good enough? And the whole conversation hangs on this. The Jews thought that they had this whole righteousness thing figured out and that they were good to go with God. But when it came down to it, that their trump cards would win them the proverbial victory. But the story of the gospel is this. It is God coming to us to make us right because we are incapable. All of the trump cards we create in our lives give us a false hope. And we think they can save us. We think they can make us right, but they can't. We see from this conversation that Jesus didn't come with anger or wrath. Jesus came on a rescue mission to rescue you and I, a people who did not know that we needed to be rescued because sin blinds. And we, along with the Jewish guys in this conversation, look at ourselves and our lives and we think, hey, we're okay. But Jesus comes to us and says we're not. He says we have a sickness and a disease, and it's called sin. We are captured by it. We are enslaved by it. And he wants to set us free. Jesus comes to take away our old nature, our sin nature, and give us a new nature, a clean nature. 2 Corinthians 5:17 is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. It says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. Behold, the new has come. When we give our lives to Jesus, we are trading our filthy rags for his clean rags. We trade our sin nature for his new nature. We trade our inherited wrath for his inherited righteousness. We hand over our earned wrath for his earned righteousness. We trade our losing trump cards for his winning trump card. Ephesians 2:8 says, for by grace you have been saved And this is not of your own doing. It is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast. You can't take credit for the work that God does in your life. Quick story. A couple years ago, my wife and I went to an electronics store here in town to get new phones because our phone contract expired. And one of the most awkward situations that I consistently get myself into, which is probably normal, is you're buying a piece of electronic equipment and then somebody offers you the extended warranty. And they will not let it die. No thanks. But did you know? No thanks, I'm really not interested. But did you know it does this and this and this? And I got really good at saying no to it. But in this one situation, the lady that was explaining it to me, she said the magic word. She said, our warranty covers water damage. And if you know anything about electronics, water is the enemy of electronics. So that made me like, okay, sold. But I didn't just make sure it covered like, spilling a little water. I said, listen, if I drop this thing on the toilet and it gets flushed a couple times by accident, am I covered? And she said, yeah, I prefer you tell me that it got dropped in the toilet before I take it from you, but yeah, it's covered. I said, I can do that. So fast forward a couple months, I'm on vacation, and one of my favorite things to do with my father is that we go scuba diving together. And so I'm thinking, hey, this is going to be a great opportunity. I've got this new phone. It's got an awesome camera in it. I'm going to get a waterproof case. I'm going to take it scuba diving. So I go get a waterproof case for it, and it says it's only good for 6 feet. And I'm thinking, that's not great. I'm going like 30 to 40. So I look up a review online, and it tells me, hey, it'll go 30 to 40 feet. I'm like, perfect. So I put the phone in the case, get into the water. I stick it down in the sleeve of my wetsuit. I'll just pull it out when I get down there, and I'm good to go. I'll take pictures. Well, I get down to the bottom of the ocean, pull my phone out and look at it, and I hit the power button to turn the screen on, and I go to touch the camera app, and nothing happens. And I'm thinking, what did I miss? Because underwater, the pressure is distributed evenly. So on a touch screen, the screen protector was like pressing every point on the screen that could possibly be touched at one point. So that was like useless. So whatever, I stuck it back in my sleeve. Like 10 minutes later, my arm starts like burning up, like my arm is on fire. So I pull my phone out, and it's doing this crazy like flickering. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so bad. I hope I don't die. So maybe you can get electrocuted with a phone underwater. I don't know. So I stick it back in my sleeve, get back up to the boat. I pull my phone out, and I look at it, and I'm looking at it. I'm like, it looks perfectly fine. What's the problem? Why isn't it working? And so I start tapping it, and then I slowly notice these little air bubbles start to come up from in the case. I'm like, oh, no. Because prior to that, I'd taken a bunch of pictures on vacation, and I didn't back them up. So my fault. But anyway, so later on, we get home. I take the phone out of the case, and I'm looking at it. I'm like, if you didn't know any better, there's not a scratch on this phone. It looks perfectly new. It looks great. Like if you didn't know any better, you'd say there's nothing wrong with the phone. But the second you turn it on its side and you start to look in the ports and the volume buttons and whatnot, I start to see this orange and reddish coloring come out. And I know what that means, rust. This thing on the inside is absolutely destroyed, filthy, dirty, rusty, corroded, and it was messed up. And so I started thinking, man, that's just like us most days in our life. When we clean ourselves up, we say, hey, we look great on the outside, we put on a front for people, but in the inside, we are just messed up. And the beauty of the gospel is that Jesus doesn't just fix us on the outside, he fixes us from the inside. Jesus is the only trump card. Let me ask you a question this morning. You may look good on the outside, but how are you doing on the inside? Have you been made right? Have you believed the lie that you can be made right with God based on what someone else has done? Are you holding on to someone else, maybe your father, your grandparents? Are you holding on to something else as your trump card? Or have you believed the lie that you can be made right with God based on being a good person, by being moral, by behaving? Are you holding on to that as your trump card? Or are you trusting in the finished work of Jesus at the cross to free you from your slavery? Jesus knew our condition. He put on flesh, came to earth, dwelt among us. He lived a perfect life that he gave up willingly as a sacrifice to pay for our sins on the cross. Then 3 days later, he was raised from the grave, defeated sin, Satan, and death, and now sits at the right hand of the Father in heaven. If you're a Christ follower this morning, you were not rescued and set free from your sin by your parents or by anything you did. You were a slave in captivity, unable to do that. Jesus set you free.